Сайн байцгаана уу хөтлөгчтэй. Өнөөдөр манай de facto нэвтрүүлгийн зочноор Hawaii Pacific University буюу Хавайн их сургуулийн эдийн засгийн профессор ноён Кэн Скүлланд оролцож байна. Good evening.
Yeah, good evening.
What is your mission this time to Mongolia?
Yeah. Well, I do a lot of conferences and speaking engagements throughout the summer. And I was very pleased to be invited here to participate in the Free Market Academy and to meet with the Economic Club and with you. I'm delighted. My wife organizes Austrian economics summits twice in Shanghai, once in Bratislava, Slovakia, once now this summer in Bali, Indonesia, and next year in Marrakesh, Morocco. Mm-hmm. We bring together free market, Austrian economists and thinkers from all around the world, about 150 attendees, and we had about 40 speakers this last year from maybe 20 different countries. Mm-hmm. And they basically talk about the wide range of libertarian free market ideas, that's also then she organized this week-long seminar of economics classes for students at Shenyang, mm-hmm. at Northeastern University. I spoke also at the Renmin University in Beijing and the Prime Institute in Cambodia and the Bastiat Society in Sri Lanka this summer. Then after this, I go back to teaching in Hawaii.
Please tell us about since we talk about Austrian School of Economics, mm-hmm. and a certain direction of economic teaching, or if you wish, what kind of major, say, branches of economic teachings are existing, and what makes that Austrian school so specific?
Yeah, well, I usually portray 4 different categories. The Marxian school is that the government should own all the resources and make all the decisions for society. What is to be produced, how, and for whom. The Keynesian school of thought is focused in on government intervention in the economy through fiscal policy, spending, taxation, mm-hmm. Debt, and regulatory controls over every aspect, directing the economy as officials in government see fit. A third school of thought is the monetarist school that argues that monetary policy through banking regulation, interest rates, and money supply is the way to control and manipulate the economy, utilizing the banking system. And the Austrian school argues that they're all the cause of the problem, not the solution. It's sort of like a disease masquerading as its own cure. The government creates problems and then creates more agencies and officials to try and solve those problems they created in the first place. The Austrians are ones who believe that it is better to trust individuals with their own decision making, that not only do you own yourself, but you own the product of your wealth. The government shouldn't intervene by trying to manipulate your behavior with spending and taxation, incentives, and punishments. Because government officials aren't any smarter than the rest of us. And as a matter of fact, they're much less smart. It's just that when they spend other people's money, they spend it rather grandly on their friends and on the things that they like. And in monetary policy, it's the most perverse because the people don't know the impact that inflation has by destroying savings and banking and creating boom and bust cycles. That manipulation of money hurts everybody in general and redistributes wealth from people living on fixed incomes to those who have much more wealth, but especially the governments. So the free market champions, the ones who are champions of individual liberty, the rights to run your own life as you choose, those are the Austrians. They argue that the Austrian this is the reason it's called Austrian is because Ludwig von Mises mm-hmm. and Friedrich Hayek were both from Austria. They fled Austria when Hitler marched into Austria, mm-hmm. and they went to United States and England mm-hmm. and championed the true free market ideal that I espouse.
You and me both are members of the Mont Pelerin Society.
Yes.
which is kind of representing that Austrian school through Hayek and later on Friedman. Why that Austrian school is becoming that popular?
Finally, people are realizing that many of the troubles that they're experiencing in their economic life are caused by the coercive powers of government. By taxing and spending, it opens the door for extraordinary amounts of corruption in society, where people who profess to be seeking the public interest are really serving their own interests and the interests of their friends and cronies that keep them into power.
That's what's happening in this country. You know, people were expecting with this political freedom, which occurred with our first democratic election 25 years ago. In fact, we have celebrated that anniversary recently. People were expecting they will receive immediately economic prosperity, which was not the case. Well, it was the case only few people who had the special access, and only a few entrepreneurs who really made success, of course, but majority, 1/3 of the country is about the poverty line. And now people are a bit frustrated. Now some of you said that it's because political freedom, etc. And Mongolia is not unique in that sense. What would be the major economic policy that a country like Mongolia would implement to you?
I used as a guide to economic policy and the rankings of many countries of the world the Economic Freedom of the World Index that the Fraser Institute has constructed out of Canada. And they rank countries on 5 different criteria of allowing the production of wealth. One is the levels of government taxation and spending. How much does the government take from producers in society? And another is the legal rights to your own property and to contracts that you're making. Is that secure? A third is sound money. How secure and sound is the money system in a country? Third is openness to trade internationally. And the last is degrees of regulation and control.
Okay.
Now, the more free people are, the less corruption there is, because there's less opportunities to sell favors, either to your friends or to punish your enemies. And the greater opportunity is to reward people for their economic activity. So that people then like to do things more because they're being rewarded for it, they prosper. But if that is all removed from them, they lose the incentives for production and productive activity. And my best example is of a country that went from very low on the ranking to very high on the ranking, New Zealand. And this was done by the socialists of New Zealand, who actually implemented the most radical free market reforms of the 20th century for an industrial country. They ended the subsidies that they were giving to their farmers, the highest subsidies in the world. They ended them overnight, within 3 months. And the farmers then soon started farming smart instead of farming just to the subsidies, and they actually earned more money on less land than ever before.
What was the key of that change?
The person who was most responsible for this took the ideas of Friedrich Hayek, the Austrian economist who founded the Mont-Pelerin Society, and he said we must get rid of privileged subsidies. I asked Richard Preble, who was the assistant finance minister, you're a socialist and you're implementing these free market reforms. How is this possible? This isn't normally associated with socialism. And he says, you know, as a socialist, I always have been, always will be. As a socialist, I oppose privilege. And every government intervention, every government favor is a privilege to some at the expense of the many. And so he thought, we've got to get rid of these privileges and allow the rights of individuals to pursue their own activity.
So he cut the subsidies
He
to
ended
farmers.
the subsidies, from the highest subsidies in the world to zero. And soon the farmers not only became very prosperous, but they became the strongest advocates of getting rid of the subsidies for everybody else.
Because a subsidy to farmers distorts the prices at the end on the market.
Yeah.
And market prices, when it is distorted, this also business information is distorted, isn't it?
Exactly. And they were doing such stupid things that they do in the United States, Europe and Japan as well, actually destroying food to keep prices up for the farmers. They were feeding the sheep back to the sheep. Now, the farmers didn't mind. Their income was good, but it was terribly costly to the whole of society.
See, here in Mongolia, under the cause to supply, to be sufficient with wheat, our government keep subsidizing the farmers who are harvesting or growing wheat substantially. And now after 2-3 years, they demand more. And they don't pay from the previous years, still they want to receive the same amount. Then it immediately reflects the flour factories. They say that, look, your quality is not enough, we need to import the higher quality things. Then they start fighting. At the end, usually it's end up being paid again by the government. How do you see this chain kind of subsidies?
The problem with subsidies is as soon as that a farmer or anybody gets benefits from the government, they become dependent on the politicians. The politicians know this. They want that dependency because then they can count on them at the next election or the next contribution or the payoff. And the problem with it for the farmer is that they lose the incentive to adjust to the market. Maybe they're producing the same kind of wheat over and over again, when in fact they should be trying barley or alfalfa or corn or
depending
something
on
else,
the demand.
depending on the market, yeah. And so then when they're totally removed from the market competition, they lose all of their competitive edge. Now they're more dependent on the politicians because they can't compete on the international market. This happened in rice in Japan. The rice farmers became so dependent on the government, they forgot how to produce good quality, efficiently produced rice. And now they're so dependent on the politicians that the politicians have them in their hand.
Yeah, let's shift to the other dimension of, say, they call it social care. Now, the government in Mongolia have been even distributing cash to every children, every family, and for the family who has more than 5 children, becomes kind of sufficient, and neither works hard, nor tries to do something. So how do you find that regulation? Because in a society, a part of society cannot work due to many reasons. How to take care of those people and not to take care of everything? How does it work?
The perverse thing about that kind of bribery, and that's what the politicians are doing.
Okay.
They're bribing the population with their own money, and while they give the appearance of being popular, generous people like Santa Claus, I don't know if you have that image here, but of someone generously giving to people, what they're really doing at the same time is making life expensive. See, most of the welfare, I believe, goes to their corporate cronies in all kinds of government favors. That makes life expensive. So then the government appears to be generous by handing out some crumbs to the population to help them afford the expensive life that the government made in the first place. That's why I say the government is like a disease masquerading as its own cure. They pretend to be generous to the population when in fact they are doing the most to harm the general population. You know, the cost of food, housing.
How to get this understood by ordinary citizens? Because some, today they need dinner, to feed their children, to heat their house, home. It's kind of hard to explain them that they should not do it. So what is the hardest matter here?
Well, one of the things that I find the most disturbing is that the most propaganda, the most brainwashing, you might say, of government program is done in government schools. I think that people, in order to, in the long run, start thinking independently of government, is they need to have educations of their children independent from the government as well. And that means, you know, true freedom to choose your own education system, your own school, your own teachers, where they are responsive to the parents and the students as their customers. And by competition in the education marketplace, then you get the challenge to the government as the big brother that is your godlike figure. It isn't God. These politicians are some of the worst people of society that have all the power of media at their disposal to give the best presentation.
That's almost the ideal case here in Mongolia. Another aspect in this regard is our social insurance. I mean, health insurance, the pension fund, which are run in the worst possible way. And people don't know how much money you have in your pension account. They say they have an account, but nobody is telling them how much you have their money. So how to be here?
The greatest damage to the pension fund, to savers, to wage earners is government's inflation. They print money all the time, generating rising prices, and people generally don't realize that it's the rising prices which they consider now as inevitable. Well, prices always go up. Well, they only go up because the government's always printing money and spending it. So it shatters the dreams of savers. You know, why save in the future if the government's going to diminish the purchasing power of the money?
Yes, they don't believe in the future.
Yeah. And that's why you don't know what the pension is that you can count on in the future, because they undermine the currency.
I remember some Austrian school economists say that inflation is kind of a robbery.
It is.
By the state.
Exactly.
Why?
Yeah. Well, for example, suppose I start printing up money and I exchange it for products from you. I pay you money for your cell phone. Then I have your cell phone and you have money. Because I printed up of it, all of the money in society becomes worth less, and I get the goods. Okay? That would be robbery.
When you want to sell it back, it's already expensive. So I pay more money than I before. But the other line you have mentioned at your lecture was because the government in such a case, in such a countries like Mongolia, where it has social welfare, etc., the government usually is the largest player in the economy, buyer, spender, yet printer of money. So when you said, because they are largest, they can spend first everything. Or the single winner is the government itself of the inflation, isn't it?
Yes. The biggest debtors are always win during inflation because they get to pay back in cheaper money. Governments are the biggest debtors in every country of the world. Those who own land and real estate win because as your purchasing power goes down, everyone wants to hold land. Government is the biggest landowner in every country of the world. The one who owns gold, the one who owns foreign currencies, the one who owns museum collectibles, those are all winners. And the government is the biggest owner of all those things in every country of the world. And so, of course, they love inflation because the government benefits enormously by it. And they don't even realize, you know, the government can always tax. They can pay for things by taxing people, but if they tax people directly, they might resist, they might rebel. They could borrow, but people don't want to loan money to a government that may be, you know, getting into trouble. So the easiest way to take money from the prosperity of the country is to print money. And they have this monopoly, fiat money, which is a government monopoly over the currency. If you tried to use some other currency that was more stable and sound, they would prosecute you.
Exactly. And we talk about printing our money, or we talk about the government debt. Then there is a term called sovereign debt, when the government borrows abroad in hard currency, which is the case in Mongolia. The government keeps borrowing. And in democracy, they being changed every 4 years. And in a lot of cases, they will not even be there, these people who borrowed money, at the time when we are to pay. How do you see the excessive sovereign debt size? How much it is to be allowed? Should it be allowed? To which level?
Well, it shouldn't be allowed at all. Frankly, I don't like the idea of the government borrowing now for spending, saying that future generations, the children yet unborn and unable to vote, are going to have to pay for it. I think that's a fraud. It's a fraud also for the politicians to get elected saying, we will pay our own way, and then after they get elected, they start borrowing this money, putting unfunded liabilities and expectations on the future generations of taxpayers. So actually, in countries like Greece and many of the countries of the world that are way into debt, I think the best thing that could happen would be for them to default on the debt, because for the first time, then it would hold those who loan them money accountable also for that debt. They're not loaning to the taxpayers of the country, they're loaning to the politicians. And they expect the politicians to tax the people to pay it back. Now, if I borrow money and say, you have to pay it back, you would say, no way. And yet that's what every government, the way every politician behaves. And so I say, default on it, because that will increase the credit rating of the business in that community.
It is ideally. But in a country like Greece, which was a kind of start of democracy, civilization, the great thinkers. How come a country like Greece could allow all this happening all the way to this level that today now they are almost starving? What happened? Why?
It's known as being probably the most corrupt government in Europe. I don't think the general population really had much control over their governments. That's a problem with democracy. A lot of times it's manipulated by very, very powerful players, and the general population are victimized by even democracy, especially this kind of welfare state democracy where favors by enormous amounts are handed out. There's no one in politics who's held personally accountable, criminally accountable for the behavior. If their country fails, they go off to a resort and they're happy and fine. But frankly, I think people ought to be held personally accountable for their behavior, just as in the private market. They should be held accountable in the public market. And I think that these... now, it is possible for Greece to pay off, for the government of Greece to pay off these debts, because the government of Greece owns a lot of property. They own 38 airports. They own 12 ports. They own motorways. They own property in New York City and Washington, D.C. They could sell all these things if they wanted to. The thing is, governments don't really want to. Politicians don't really want to, because they don't see the benefit to themselves.
Exactly, it's like our Mongolian airlines. Every politician is promised before election they will privatize, and they never do it because then they will not have planes to fly wherever they want, free.
That's right. Now, if a private business commits fraud, false advertising, or misrepresentation, you hold him personally accountable, he goes to jail for fraud. I think the same kind of accountability should hold to politicians.
Government.
That's right. That's right. And a lot of times there's this different view that government is somehow different than the politicians that make up government.
We should regard government as another entity that should be legally can be
accountable for fraud and misrepresentation the same way that someone in the private sector. Then you'll have people be very careful about what they promise if they know they can be held accountable for those promises.
Okay, close to the end of the interview, I really want to know more about this book translated into Mongolian, Jonathan Gullibell Adventure.
Yes.
Tell us about this book. It is translated several years ago, and now it's reprinted again.
Yes, right.
Please tell us about the story of the book, how came this book exist.
I'm very pleased to say that it's now in 80 editions, published in 80 editions in 50 languages.
Oh, 50, okay.
That's right. And in Mongolia, this is actually the second printing of the second edition. And I would say that it's been very, very successful as theater across Africa, as theater in Slovakia, as musical productions in Kazakhstan. We're hoping even someday to make it a movie with the Hollywood team of animators, and some investors from China have offered. We're trying to put this together. The idea started off as radio commentary, just as your great commentary here. I decided that a humorous story that would reach out to people with our friendly, humorous satire would be effective, and it was. It was wildly accepted in Hawaii. I was writing it as a radio commentary for an all-news radio station around 1979 and 80.
Okay.
And then over the years, we put it together into a book. We started international publication of it, and it's taken off because people, I don't go and ask people to publish it. They come and ask me because they say, we need a tool to reach to young people and an introduction to free market ideas, because they're not getting it in government schools. And so I'm trying to reach out with whole ideas about the importance of individual liberty and freedom.
And you did. I mean, this is a very interesting book. It's already second edition of and second printing. And what else do you do?
I'm the president of the International Society for Individual Liberty. We're an organization that promotes free market ideas with conferences and student camps around the world, publications that we try to encourage like this. I'm also a professor of, associate professor of economics at Hawaii Pacific University, and there I'm also the director of the Entrepreneurship Center. I'm on the board of scholars for the Grassroots Institute of Hawaii, and just very lively activity with things that my family is involved with. Actually, my wife and my daughter share these interests, and my daughter's in Santiago, Chile, writing for Sovereign Man, a newsletter on helping to internationalize people with employment and investments.
That's great.
And my wife is the organizer of these conferences around the world.
Overall, let's say, this idea of individual freedom, is it winning or losing, or what is the perspective?
I'm an optimist, and I think that it's winning. My wife grew up in China during the Cultural Revolution, very, very hard times. As the people of Mongolia and the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, know what life was like. And I would say that life is so much better than it was under those days. But that's not to say we couldn't return to those hard times if we lose sight of the value of liberty and freedom. So that's what motivates us. I was always driven by the specter of the Cold War, that tyranny is something around the corner. We need to be on our guard all the time against it.
Exactly. I do share your value and what you have just now talked. And I exactly trying to do my best so that this authoritarian regime does not happen again on the soil. Ken, thank you very much. You are always inspiring.
Thank you so much. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you. За хүн төлөвчтэй өнөөдөр манай de facto нэвтрүүлгийн зочноор Хавай-Номхон далайн сургуулийн эдийн засгийн профессор ноён Кэн Скүлланд оролцлоо. Баярлалаа.
Thank you. This was a lot of fun. I mean, I get energy from